think of colonial legacies, I think of it in 3 or 4 different registers: the political, cultural, and social, spatial, and intellectual. And as I was saying, Pakistan is one of those unique nations that has retained a lot of these colonial legacies so many times uncritically, without giving much thought to it. Or maybe there is thought about it, but not really perpetuated in the educational system and elsewhere. So I'll talk about these 4 registers and then answer any questions that you might have. But first of all, many thanks for all of you for inviting me to give this talk. And so political, if we go by that, you have to come to it from different scholarly strains. So you can come to it through Ranajit Guha's work, Dominus Without Hegemony. We can come to it through how Echele Mbembe discusses the political structures built under colonialism, and to some extent through Chandra Mohanty. But what all of these people are trying to suggest is that what happens under colonialism is there is this specific political system that is created, which is not similar to the metropolitan political system. So if you go by Ranajit Guha, while the bourgeois state is being developed in the West, let's say when Britain was colonizing India, while they are developing their own civic structures in their own home countries, they are not developing the same structures in the colonies. Right? So the colonies were governed, if you go by Echele Mbembe, under commandment, right? They were mostly not democratic institutions. And they had a top-down model of administration. So the political system, while it is developing in the West and refining itself, is stymied in the colonies. The same goes for Pakistan, because we were part of India. And along with it is the administrative state. How is it developed? Right? So the British rely mostly on the civil services, not on the people's representatives, but they work through the functionaries that they themselves have selected and appointed, like deputy commissioners and assistant commissioners, tax collectors. And these people hold enormous power. They live in palatial houses, they have servants, they live on taxpayer money, but they think of their own people as inferior. There is another way of thinking imbued into the civil services process, and that is we have come through a very rigorous selection process. We are better than others. I mean, if I can take that civil service exam in my sleep and still pass it, but the idea is that these people internalize this idea that they are better, and they are better than people that they are supposed to serve, right? This mentality comes from colonialism, right? That is one of the legacies, administrative and political. Now, in terms of politics, and you can read Chandra Mohanty for it, since the British needed a stable system to collect taxes, so they further strengthened the socio-political hierarchies which existed in the culture. So who do they go to if they need something done, right? I mean, they go to your local Vaderas, they go to your local Nawabs, they go to, if there are no landowning elite in a territory, they give them land and create this elite, the landed elite, because then through them they can keep the people in check, control them, and then extract whatever they need to extract. So the system that develops is a reinvigorated feudal system, right? So the British do not touch the feudal system of India nor of what is Pakistan. When they leave, it is still intact. You go to Sindh, there are people who still own people, right? That's the kind of country we all have created and sustained. And so politically, when we come out of colonialism, we have civic structure, the administrative system that the colonizers had created, which is non-representative and which places our own people above our own people. That is intact, and it still is. And politically speaking, in terms of the social hierarchies, the hierarchies of class that they created, especially in the rural areas, they remain intact, right? And we inherit them. So these are two pernicious legacies that we still have. In the last 75 years, no sincere effort has ever been made in Pakistan to create a land reform. The politicians work through the same system, so do the dictators. I mean, they use the same waderas and same nawabs and same, aap log Punjab mein rehte hain, you know who I'm talking about. So these are the two legacies, administrative, political, and cultural, which maybe pre-existed colonialism but become heightened under colonialism because the colonizers use them to control us, and we inherit them. The spatial, I mean, if you've read Wretched of the Earth by Fanon, Fanon describes the Kasbah and the land of the Europeans living next to it, right? And now his example is Algeria. I mean, think of it, we still have that Kasbah, the city, and cantonment divide, right? So the cantonments were created by the British to house Royal Indian Army, the officers and the battalions. The idea was to have military cantonments all the way from the south of India to the north, to control, of course, the territory. That is the spatial arrangement of the colony. We inherited that. We still have it. And so that arrangement of space makes for the citizens of Pakistan spaces that are controlled, that they cannot go into. Sometimes they cannot live in those spaces. And if you can live in those spaces, you have to be part of a certain upward mobile elite, or you have to have money. Or you have to be a servant who lives in a servant quarter. Those are your 2 points of entry into these privileged spaces. That spatial arrangement was given to us by the colonizers. If you look at the original cities of India, the streets were narrow in India. The cities were organic. Have you ever wondered why the Indians, my ancestors, why did they keep the streets narrow? Like if you even go to Attak and places like that. Because when the streets were narrow, the northern invaders, their cavalry couldn't ride through your streets. Okay. You could defend a city better if the houses were adjacent and there were narrow streets with tall brick buildings. That was the strategic reason for it, not that we people didn't want more space. Our rural areas, of course, had that. But the urban areas were developed so that they could be defendable, right? But we get that spatial divide. Now, that spatial divide has further been aggravated or expanded through developments, right? So now we don't just have the Okara cantonment and then Gujarat cantonment. We also have defense housing societies, right? So those are commercialized versions of organized space, right? Hierarchicized space. You have to have money to buy a plot there. You have to have money to build a house there. So we have a state in which there are places which are privileged. They have more facilities, more electricity, more water. The entry to it is controlled and closed to most of the average citizens of Pakistan. This is another legacy that we inherited and we proudly perpetuate in Pakistan, right? Meanwhile, I had a friend from Pakistan a few years ago, and I asked her, I was like, "Aapke mohalle ka naam kya hai?" So, and mohalla, is considered a derogatory term, right? So she immediately corrected me, and she's like, "It's not a mohalla, it's a sector such and such of Islamabad, and we don't have gully numbers, we have street numbers." So it's so deeply imbued in us that we feel embarrassed if we live in the old city and in a non-developed part of the country, and if we don't have that spatial privilege. And then we come to the intellectual aspects of it. Now, if you think of it, what is it that we grew up privileging in our classes? English is privileged over Urdu. English as a subject of study. It is still the language of power. If you can speak it better, chances are, you think you're better, and plus, chances are you'll get a better job. And if you can write better in it, your chances are that you will do well. Intellectual traditions, we still think in terms of how the West thinks or how the Western scholars have thought. What happens in intellectual colonialism is that our desires and our idea of the aesthetic, of the beauty, is reshaped, it's redrawn. And so when we are intellectually conquered, we think of ourselves as inferior, right? And this is where Spivak's theorization of wording comes in. When the Europeans, when they word the world for us, what happens is, in the process of writing about the colonies or reporting about the colonies, the colonizers generate a way of looking at it. Now we, as colonized subjects, we detect that. We see our own world from the point of view of our colonizers. We start looking at our own world from their point of view. So what happens if the British said we are primitive people and uncivilized? We start thinking of ourselves as uncivilized and primitive, unpad, pendu, right? So intellectually then, even when we are trying to think radically, we have to undo so much of that damage of colonial legacies. So overall, then, we inherit a political system that is sort of non-representative, and it retains the hierarchies that were hardened and built during colonialism. We get a cultural identity where, and you will have to read Ngugi Thiong'o's work on this role of language and culture. We develop a cultural identity where we are embarrassed of our own culture. You are sitting in Punjab. How many of you tell your children to speak Punjabi in public, right? Or with you? Chances are most of you, I'm not blaming anyone. We would prefer that they speak Urdu. And if they speak Punjabi, a lot of people will be embarrassed of it, right? Why do we feel like that? Isn't that our language? Isn't that a beautiful language with a great history? The reason we feel like that is because of privileging of English and then Urdu as a national language. How did Urdu become so privileged? I mean, 2% population of Pakistan speaks it, right? It's a beautiful language and it has great poetry, but that's the colonial influence and legacy. And then the intellectual. Overall, these are some of my thoughts. Now, if you want to read further into it and develop your understanding of colonial legacies better, I highly recommend Ranajit Guha's work, especially his Dominus Without Hegemony, which I had not challenged, but objected to in one of my published works because there is a slight distinction that he misses. Then Chandra Mohanty, if you want to read how the colonizers used existing hierarchies of the feudal system that existed in India, and then in the process ending up hardening those hierarchies even more. And then the spatial is right in front of you. You can see it. And the intellectual, of course, Edward Said and Fanon. These are the people to read. Overall, to be honest, like, what can we do? Like, what can you sitting in Pakistan do? Is, those of you who are studying and who are students, one is that you just buy into this idea that these are the things we need to know and then follow to be successful. That's good, right? You can do that. You have to learn the discourse of the dominant group. You have to know it to undo it. So the best would be that you learn these people. If you want to undo the imperatives of colonial legacies or what is still happening in the world, you cannot do it from the place of unknowing, right? Or unawareness. You have to learn these theories and these ways of looking at reality, but in a way where you can hold on to who you are, right? What your cultural and political identity is, not as a hardened identity, but where you preserve and take pride in who you are and then are open to change. The most dangerous tendency would be where you become embarrassed of your own culture and then imprint on yourself this fake idea of, I can speak English in the British accent and I know my Shakespeare. There is nothing wrong in knowing your Shakespeare or writing about Shakespeare. But believing that Shakespeare is the greatest poet on earth, that is where you become colonized, because I will not trade a single verse of Ghalib, for the entire oeuvre of Shakespeare or Hafiz, or Bhulle Shah. So the idea is not to be nativist, not to say we are better. No, the idea is to learn these knowledges, to discuss these things with anyone in the world, but retaining what is valuable in our own culture, and then take the knowledge from wherever so that we can change our own cultures, right? So by now, we should have had a political system in which the bureaucrats do not hold so much power, but rather our elected representatives do. So you shouldn't have to go to the deputy commissioner's office to get something resolved. You should have to go to your local union council, right? And why is that important? It's important because people who are in the union council, by and large, are responsive to you. You can go to them and say, we gave you votes, right? If you don't do this for our street, we will not give you votes. What do you tell to a deputy commissioner? I mean, he is impervious to what you say. The only way you can threaten them is by saying, I'm going to call my representative, I'm going to call my MNA or MPA and tell them you are corrupt. Our previous government, in all their wisdom, even took away that power from the MNAs. So technically, by reducing political influence in bureaucracy, they made the bureaucracy more powerful, because no one could hold them accountable anymore. So we could change that. Cultural, I already talked about. Spatial, I don't know. Think of it. When I look at Pakistan, when I travel through it, I feel kind of sad because there are no empty spaces anymore, right? Okay, our population is growing, right? But wherever you go, there is a housing scheme here, a housing scheme there. You can't step out of the highway and say, I'm going to go for a walk here. There are some trees. We are increasingly flattening the land and building massive developments because everyone wants a big palatial house, those who can afford it. But while that is happening, our shanty towns and our mohallas and our poor neighborhoods are also increasing. So we are creating spatially this country which the British had left us. pristine cantonments and uncared for urban uh, cities. We are perpetuating them. There is a flight from the main cities, the old cities, to these new developments. But these are self-contained developments. So what are we creating then? I mean, if you've seen Barrier Town, the young people who grow up there, first of all, there is a flattening of class. Chances are, if they run into a poor person, that person is, a servant in that area or something. They don't have a chance of living next to someone who might not be rich, who might be poor. So there is a flattening of class. Then there is a artificiality to that life. They have their clubs, they have green lawns like zoos, right? So when these children grow up there, the moment they leave the walls of that development and enter GT Road or enter Sadr, that becomes a hostile territory to them. In their own country, they feel alienated because they are outside of that sanitized neighborhood. Now, I'm not saying we should destroy these neighborhoods, but we should think critically. And this is the same legacy that the colonizers left us, the spatiality of experience, right? And then intellectual, you all are in an intellectual environment. Ask yourself, why do I think like this? If I'm privileging English literature over Urdu literature, is it because English literature is inherently better, or is it because I've been taught to think like that? And then see how you can undo it. I don't have any recipes for change, but these are some of my thoughts on these topics. So I'm sort of going to conclude here and hope that you have some questions, and I'll be happy to answer those. But let me thank Dr. Mazhar Hayat and Dr. Asif and everyone else for giving me this chance to talk to you about these topics. Thank you so much.